And then it is recording now.
Good evening. We'll get going here in a minute. This is the right Zoom session for the Citizens Wildfire Academy. Provide just maybe another minute or two for some of those others to join us, and then we'll get going.
And Supervisor Gardner, I just wanted to note that this is being recorded and the video will be made available on the county YouTube channel. If anybody isn't following, it's a great resource to find all things Madison County.
Thank you, Shireen. Appreciate that information. Okay, let's get going. My name is Bob Gardner. I'm one of the Mono County supervisors and will be hosting these Citizens Wildfire Academy sessions. Welcome. I'm glad you could all join us. These are a sort of an attempt to provide information about wildfire, and I think we'll get a great sense of that tonight. Hosted by the Eastern Sierra Council of Governments. These sessions are also sponsored by several other public and nonprofit agencies, and these sessions, which will occur on the third Monday night of every month at 6 p.m. for the next 7 months. These are all aimed at providing information for our residents and visitors about wildfire and how we can certainly think about it, plan for it, and react to it if necessary. Our goal is to try to reduce some of the anxiety about wildfire and certainly answer your questions about it through these virtual sessions on the Zoom platform. Tonight's session is entitled The History of Wildfire in the Eastern Sierra and California. And I think we'll have a great overview by Dave Carle generally about that. And some of the topics also we'll be getting into in more detail in later sessions. These sessions will be recorded. And as Shireen said, they'll be available on YouTube. And I think she just put that information in there. So let's get to it. Our speaker tonight is Dave Carle. Dave is a retired state park ranger and actually the author of several books. One of the most important ones is about fire. And I have it right here. Let's see if my screen will show it. Yeah, there it is. A great book that just came out. Its second edition just came out. And I would encourage you for your homework to get this book and read it. I think Dave put that information in the chat, but it's a great book about fire. And he has a lot of experience in terms of doing the research and being a state park ranger in this issue. So without spending any more time, let me introduce to you David Carle. Go ahead, Dave.
Thank you, Bob, and thank you for the invitation to do this. I am going to, be talking for quite a while here, so I want to get my screen sharing started right now. And so let's see here. Full screen. Somebody tell me, Bob, can you see that?
Yes.
Okay, good. All right, then we're in business. So Bob said that this is, and mentioned that this is an introduction. You have a very interesting set of topics to deal with in the coming months, and I'll touch on just about all of those tonight in a brief introductory way. I am focusing with this talk, seems appropriately, on the Eastern California portion of the state, although you'll see I'm going to use some topics and some images from elsewhere in the state to make some points. So let's see if this will advance. All right, good. So humans are the species on this planet that has been most able to utilize fire as a tool, take advantage of this natural force that's on the earth, and that all plants and animals that are affected by fire have adapted to in various ways, and depending on what the particular natural fire conditions are in a particular area. California, almost all of it is a a landscape of fire where fire is very important. So we use fire obviously in ways that benefit us, we humans. We cook with it and we heat with it and we sit and warm our hands in a campfire, but we also do so many things when you get to thinking and looking into it. We have little fires that are in the internal combustion engines that we do so much with and use in so many different ways. All kinds of different beneficial uses of fire that we've figured out. But we also have the challenge of the fact that wildfires in the areas where we occupy the space, where we live and where we work and where we have our businesses and all, wildfires can become something like this, can be very frightening, very damaging. They can be devastating and can cause tremendous problems. This picture I chose because of the drama of how this is in a chaparral community, actually down in San Diego County. The flame height in chaparral can be just intensely, amazingly big. It happens that in this cedar fire, this house did survive. Maybe because it looks like some work was done around it, maybe because of how it was built and hardened, if you will, against fire, or maybe just by luck. The wind appears to be blowing sideways in this picture and away from the particular house. But anyway, that's part of the story, and that's one of the reasons why we're here. We have responded. Our society has responded, particularly in the Western states, with specialists who deal with fire when it becomes a threat. And we've not only trained individuals, and each season we hire particular people in the wildland fire regime. We have fire stations in almost every community, either volunteer manned or paid. But we also have very highly technical ways that we've found to try to deal with fire. And I'm not going to talk very much about that. And if you look at the agenda, the techniques of fighting fire are not really where we're going too much, I think, in this class. It's more an understanding of, what people who aren't specialists should do to understand about fire and our place in this fire landscape and how we can best deal with that. So firefighters and fire scientists and everybody basically should understand that there's this triangle of three critical things that go into any fire. There has to be an ignition source and something that can be heat, it can be lightning, it could be a match from where you're lighting your stove, whatever the ignition source might be to start a fire, there has to be one. There has to be oxygen present because fire is oxidation. Fire is a type of combustion that is a chemical reaction with oxygen in the atmosphere. And there has to be then, of course, something to burn. There has to be fuel. In dealing with fire as something to resist, these are the kinds of things that a firefighter will look at. They will be able to focus on. Can they use water to cool the area down and deal with that heat question? Can they smother a fire and so that oxygen can't get to it? And a lot of fuel treatment is a lot of what we're going to be talking about. Fuel treatment ahead of time to affect how a fire is going to behave, and dealing with fuels and changing how a fire advances across the landscape by dealing with fuels. So California is often described accurately as having mostly a Mediterranean climate. And climate has a lot to do with what we're going to be talking about, of course, because climate controls what kind of vegetation ends up on the landscape, climate and topography and a lot of things, but climate is a big factor. But climate is also a big factor in how dry things get, how hot things get. The Mediterranean style climate, which is mostly here in this map in blue, is typically the pattern where winter rains provide certain months of moisture and precipitation, and then there's a long drought each summer. That's the typical Mediterranean style climate. And I put this up here mainly to make a point that not all of California has that same pattern. Even though we here, let me see if I can move my mouse. Here's Mono Lake. There's the little marker there. And what you're seeing here is some different colors that are, so over here it looks like it's, continental or cold winter, dry summer. It's still a dry summer, but it does behave differently than what happens over here. And so we have different landscape, different vegetation types in these different parts of the area. We're going to talk a little bit about Eastern California, east of the Sierra Crest, the Eastern Sierra, as we generally call it, but also down into the Mojave Desert and those highlands to the south. So what happens, and one reason why we have these variations across California, this little cross section across a portion of California is getting at the concept of why we have on the east side of the mountain ranges in this state, we have a rain shadow effect. We have most of our moisture coming off of the ocean from the Pacific. And as it encounters the various ranges, the coast ranges, there's uplift, cooling. Cooler air cannot hold its moisture as vapor any longer, and it will be dropped as precipitation, as rain or snow, depending on the temperatures. And then as you come over to the east side of these ranges, again and again, you get into where the rain shadow happens because the air descends again and it gets warmer, it gets compressed, and warmer air can hold more of its water vapor in that form. And so we have the deserts, especially as we keep going farther and farther east. And we have, the Owens Valley here, it shows 5 inches of rain. And over on the west side of the Sierra, giant forest, a little bit higher elevation, but the main point is here that a lot more moisture falling, 46 inches there. So we get different landscape, different vegetation. I like this picture of a Joshua tree with the snowy Sierra off in the distance, based on basically the farther you come downhill and the farther east you go from that mountain range, the drier it's going to be. Up here at the top of Mount Dana, looking down towards the Mono Lake Basin, we have a real good, striking example of this, where you can see some forest, some pine forest, pinyon juniper, I think this is. Off in the distance, more of that darker green out there, and a lot of sagebrush scrub is out there. And there are a number of fire scars too, by the way, in this picture. And so that's that story. And I really like this particular angle of looking at the Mammoth Lakes area, because it shows the gap. It shows that there is a low place on either side, really, of Mammoth Mountain in the height of the Sierra Crest, and the moisture coming out of the west is allowed then to penetrate farther. And instead of Great Basin scrub, we'll see some pictures of that in a moment, we start to get pine forest that in a sense is encroaching on the dry Great Basin habitat. We've also got some riparian vegetation. This is where Mammoth Creek would be flowing, if we could see that in the picture. And we got some more of the very characteristic Jeffrey pine forest here in the foreground. And the town in this picture is off to the right, so it doesn't show. But all of that is part of what makes location and topography and then those specifics about elevation and climate explains the complexities of how fire is going to behave in different places. And if you look out from where you are and wherever you're living and take a look at the vegetation, there's a story being told there. So in the wetter areas, right along the creek edges especially, we get a particular kind of vegetation, this riparian, willows, cottonwoods, aspens, and it's very juicy, if you will. It's a type of lifestyle that these plants have, where their roots are in the water most of the time, and they are not very dry compared to a lot of other things we're going to talk about, and harder to burn, less likely to burn. Up high in the coniferous forest areas of both the west side and the east side. This happens to be actually over in the west side, but where we get that heavy precipitation, and especially it turns to snow, that's where the specialist trees that can handle that type of environment grow. The pines and the firs and the giant sequoias on the west side. So all of that is happening, and out in the drier regime, out in farther south of us, especially out of the Great Basin desert, we get into the Mojave Desert, and you can really read the water adaptations that the plants take to try to control the fact that they're living in a very dry environment. And all of that affects what's going to happen in terms of fire regimes that are possible in these areas. So we put together, our society does, our specialists do, things like this, a fire threat map. This comes from Calder Fire for the whole state, and it's color-coded. And if you take a look at it from our perspective in the east side, there doesn't seem to be much of this dark red. So what I did is I zoomed in. These maps actually have a whole lot more detail on them. They're very high resolution. And so here we are. Here's Lake Tahoe. Here's Mono Lake. And the white stuff, the gray stuff here, this would be the sparsely vegetated Sierra Crest. And then coming down the east side, we have these, they're very narrow compared to other parts of the state, but we have these red zones. This is where there's more vegetation. And also a factor in this fire threat is where there's more people to be threatened, because the threat that we're talking about here is basically from that perspective. And so our fire agencies try to communicate how the threat varies over time and particular conditions. They're looking at things like the fuel moisture, which makes it higher fuel moisture is harder to burn. Relative humidity of the atmosphere, of the air, is going to adjust what's going on with fuel moisture over time. They're looking at temperature. They're looking at wind forecasts. All of these things that go into what finally they translate into a category. And when things get high and extreme, that's when they really are trying to communicate that there's changes in behavior that need to be following for the people who live in these zones. So back to ignition sources and the sources that will heat up and ignite a fire. People, we'll talk about in a second, people are, like most of the fires that are ignited, the wildland fires in California. But lightning is a natural factor, and if you're looking at this again from our perspective, the east side of California is where most of the lightning comes. Now, it's not that there's no lightning, but off on the Coast Range, but very little by comparison. We get it mostly in this part of the world during the summer monsoons, which come up out of the Four Corners area down to our southeast of us, and spin thunderstorms up during the warm summer days. Moisture or rising air causes moisture to condense and fall, and along with that will be lightning. And so this was put together actually by Yosemite, and take a look at, okay, here's San Francisco Bay. Mono Lake would be straight across right about here, and look at where these high zones are. We do get the lightning, and so does the desert down to our southeast. So I said all that, and then we have events like this. In August of 2020, just 2 years ago, not even 2 years ago yet, we had a freak event. We had California had 14,000 lightning strikes that started 700 wildfires. Many of those merged into major complexes of fire. And so, and a lot of that was not in the Eastern Sierra. A lot of that was in the Coast Ranges and up into Northern California, where that map wouldn't have suggested there was much lightning. So here, that said, here's things may be changing, but whatever changed that year, it did occur. I wanted to put this in because it's not local. It's not. It's from Riverside County, which does have its very rural and desert eastern portions. But and so that the particular size of a pie slice here on this chart about what causes fires. will vary in different locations. So like lightning for us is probably would be much bigger here where lightning is shown. But take a look at some of the things that you may not think about too much, like equipment. Accidental ignitions from equipment operators on construction sites, or if someone out is mowing and the spark is struck by their mower and on a rock, all those things, that's a big one. And here's one that's not too big, really, playing with fires. The Smokey Bear, for all of his years of putting out a message aimed at kids, it was really trying to focus on that. And it turns out it's not really one of the biggest. Arson is there, and it seems like it's not going away. It just seems like it's something that is inevitable with the human nature. And a whole lot of these are undetermined and miscellaneous, so that's not real helpful. Power line is up here at the top. I'm going to talk about, I have some pictures because we've become very aware in recent years about the ignition of fires started by power lines. So we'll come back and look at that. I want to go through some of the regional local history of fires. This is taken the night that the Round Fire ignited just in February, in the winter in 2015, and burned from the east to the west, was blown by very strong winds, and it moved incredibly fast. 40 homes were lost in that one night, and really in a short period of time. Fortunately, nobody was killed in this particular fire event in Mono County. Mountain View Fire was up along north of Highway 395 up in Walker in North Mono County. Not that long ago now. It was in November of 2020. And very quickly again, though, was driven by wind. 96 structures, the ones that are shown here in red, were destroyed in that fire. A little farther north, and in a following year, Tamarack Fire got started. Move my mouse over here. This is Grover Hot Springs State Park, and some near Grover Hot Springs, out to the west of it, got started. It burned eastward. It burned for quite a while. It was many days before it finally was put out, or conditions changed to put it out. But it ended up not only crossing out of California into Nevada, but it crossed Highway 395. And some of the structures that were burned in this fire were over in that zone on the east side of Highway 395. I wanted to show you this. I just took this picture a week ago. I was driving across near Markleyville. This is just north of Markleyville. And this is a portion of that Tamarack Fire. What it did, it moved through pine forest, but take a look. Part of the story here, just almost anybody can see this. These trees were very dense. They weren't really big old growth. They were second growth, and the concept of thinning comes to mind that maybe would have changed some of this, maybe not. This was, we're going to talk about that. There's the things that happen when we have extreme weather, extreme drought, years of drought, and then we get the wind events, are change the thinking about a lot of things. Take a look though here somehow, maybe because of the work that was done along this dirt road, these trees made it through. And continuing this little trip through some of the most recent and very large fires, the Calder Fire was in August of 2021. So that's just last year, not even a year yet. It burnt a very long time. It started over to the west, and it burnt and moved and kept moving and kept moving. And it did something along with a very, very large fire to the north in northeastern California, the Dixie Fire. Those two fires did something that was unprecedented. They crossed over from the west side of the Sierra to the east side. And that's unprecedented in the sense that it's not very, you wouldn't expect it, because take a look at the Sierra Crest here. This is basically the zone where the forest stops and you get up above the tree line. And there's just not much fuel up at those elevations. But it found a route, and it found a way for embers to move down. And the stories were all over the national news. The evacuations that happened there were successful, but they were scary. Think this was a traffic jam for hours and hours as people were mandatory evacuations were underway to get people out of this area in case the fire was going to come the rest of the way into South Lake Tahoe's urban area. And it's something to think about. Any area. I live in one. Mammoth Lakes is one. Any area where there are a relatively few roads out of a residential area, where everybody who has to go has to basically follow a very limited number of choices of how to go away. It's dangerous. And happily, I mean, there's smoke here, but there's no flame. They got these people out well ahead of any threat. And then the threat actually didn't, the fire didn't come in. They were able to work with that. But when we talk about some of the other fires in California's fire history that were horrible, death numbers have happened, like the Camp Fire up in Paradise, like the Oakland Hills fire many years ago in the 90s. People were caught and overwhelmed by the fire itself as they were trying to drive out. And that's something that has to be avoided. They did a good job, I think, up there at Tahoe in making that not happen. I like this map a lot. This is not an urban story here now. This is out in our wildlands in the Inyo National Forest and some BLM land. This is Mona Lake up at the top of the picture. This is Highway 120 East going out towards Benton. Highway 395 is over in the west or the left side of this picture. And all these little, puzzle pieces that fit together have a year attached to them. This one's 1999, 2019 over here. We've got over 20 years of record here. And it's kind of interesting to think of it as puzzle pieces, because one of the things that happens if fire returns into this kind of habitat, mostly this is Jeffrey pine forest in here, or other kinds of pine. If it returns at an interval that isn't too long, then one fire will have treated the landscape there in a way that will influence what the boundaries will be of another fire that will follow. And so I want to talk about, this was an interesting one, the Springs Fire. This was a fire in 2019 that because of the conditions of across the state and the west of low fire activity, the fire agencies were able to actually allow this fire to do some treatment, if you will, on the forest out in this area. But I want to talk about something that happened not that long ago, right up in here near Mona Lake. This was called the Beach Fire. And it was started by lightning off to the east, and it burnt over towards the use area that's called South Tufa area at Mona Lake. Very high flame lengths. It was going through some really old sagebrush and other sagebrush scrub vegetation. The kind of vegetation where it's up over my head if I walk through it. And so the flame lengths were pretty scary, 30 feet type flame lengths. So this was taken from way over in Mona City on the other side after that fire got started. And this was part of the lightning storm that struck California actually in August, mid-August of 2020. And in our case here at Mona Lake, I say our because this is my home and the place I worked for so long. It came across and was blown to the west. So there's another thing, and that's a kind of an unusual thing. An easterly fire, a fire that's blowing the fire to the west. It did not reach the main visitor area, the South Tufa area at Mona Lake, but it did go into some of the tufas off between there and what's called Navy Beach. Take a look at what's happening out here, a little closer look. Before any rain or any snow had ever happened, this is an October picture. The fire was in August. The vegetation here, the shrubs that were burned off the top are not showing any life, but the vegetation you see is the salt grass out there. And it makes a point that fires don't heat the soil very deep. They burn across and heat rises. The heat doesn't penetrate very far into most soils. And so the roots of plants are generally not consumed by the way the tops of these plants were. The grass was burnt off, but immediately, because those roots were still viable and because there is some moisture in this land, they started to sprout back as grass that fall. And we did get blackened tufa. It does look different. It didn't cook them down to nothing and cause them to crumble to bits. But that is one of the effects, something new to think about. And here we're at the following spring. This is just last year about this time. And some of those, the grass, of course, it died during the winter snows and we're during the cold months. Some of those shrubs are sprouting back from their root bases. And this is greasewood, Sarcobatus. And it was just beginning at that point, and by the end of the growing season, basically in October, they'd gotten pretty big. There's a recovery going on there, and this is one of those kinds of adaptations we're going to talk about that plants have, part of the whole fire ecology story. Different adaptations for different species. Often the distance here is an area that didn't burn, and that is mostly rabbit brush. And rabbit brush was consumed out here, and it will take seeds from the nearby bushes blown in or carried in to reestablish any rabbit brush in this zone. But the greasewood has this sprouting ability from its basal roots that were not killed. Another fire in our region occurred near the Lundy Canyon, the Lundy power plant where Mill Creek runs over there. It burnt up the hill, and this was a sagebrush scrub hillside. With each spring, a few flowers would show up maybe in among the shrubs, but not very many. And a year after this fire, we had this fire follower event. The seeds were waiting there in the soil for a fire to create conditions for them to, without competition, to sprout and produce. We've got lupin here. We've got balsam leaf arrowroot. These incredible displays. And the display continued for a number of years. There's less up there now. It's still doing it, but the shrubs are just slowly starting to reestablish, and they will take over again in time. So that the name for that in fire ecology is are species that are fire followers, that actually are benefited and in some cases totally depend on the effects of fire to allow them to do their response in a very big way. This is again out of our area, poppies and what they used to call them blue dicks. I forget what the name now is. Hyacinth, wild hyacinth. The hyacinth has a bulb underground, not affected by the fire that burnt through the chaparral shrub hillside over there near Lake Berryessa. And poppies and these hyacinths are very good at this fire follower effect, taking advantage of the opening up to sunlight and opening the fact that the overhead shading is not happening from the shrubs and the competition for water. Locally, we've got a lot of aspen groves, and now and then, because aspens tend to grow in wet areas, we don't get a lot of fire in those zones. And but there was a fire called the Marina Fire north of Levining a few years ago, and the tops of this grove, the trees were killed. They're gradually now, over a period of years, they're starting to fall, but the other thing that's happening right away, very fast, was a response from the roots of these aspens that were not killed. Today, last summer, this was an early year, 2 years after the fire. Last year, these aspens the new growth was up over my head, about 6 feet tall. And actually, this is all really considered one clone, one organism, these groves like this. So the aspens will be back in time. In the pine forest, in our part of the world, we have Jeffreys. They're closely related to a cousin over in the west side, is more dominant, the ponderosa pine. And both of those species have adaptations to areas where there was relatively frequent, low intensity, low ground-based fires mostly. So Jeffrey and ponderosa have very thick bark. So this charring here at the base of this tree didn't kill the tree. It was protected by the bark. As they get older, they drop more and more branches of the lower branches, so that there won't be, a ladder fuel that carries fire up into the tops of the tree and causes a crown fire that would kill the tree. And they have, of course, in the case of this kind of pine, they have big cones that drop every year, deposit a lot of seed, and if the conditions are right, and that has to do with just how much crowding of other species and how much sun is there and a lot of things, then that benefits these trees. And so the fact, what we're talking about is that fire has been so omnipresent at its various intervals, but still omnipresent through time, through evolutionary time, that the dominant vegetation, all of the vegetation in an area has evolved to adapt to the fire and be able to survive even though they're occurring. So I described the kinds of fires that were most typical in a Jeffrey pine forest, and that's what the International Forest was basically doing here with prescribed burning in these Jeffrey pines, moving fire to reduce the amount of buildup of ground fuels that would otherwise change the character of this fire regime. Now, across the state in different locations, there's another pine tree adaptation that's quite different. Knobcone pines and bishop pines have what's called serotomous cones, and you'll see their cones not dropping each year out of the tree, but being held up in the branches. And when you look close at the cones, the scales are tightly closed. They're sealed shut in a way that heat will open them up. Think of wax melting, and now a seed can come popping out. So these pine forests, these particular kind, are a place where the mature trees will burn, and there'll be a stand replacement of trees in a fire in this forest. But at that point is when the trees release their seeds, and then there's a fertilized ashy seed bed waiting for new trees to be started. That's called serotony or serotomous cones. We have semi-serotomous cones in different areas too. The gray pines that grow in the chaparral on the other side of the hill have a very massive cone, and it does the same kind of thing where it will release seeds under the response to heat, but it also will release seeds from the heat of very hot days. Chaparral communities in the foothills, can be incredibly hot, and so these are called semi-serotomous. They'll do both approaches to dropping their seeds. And in the Sierra, lodgepole pines are semi-serotomous too. Lodgepoles are, if you think about what you know about a lodgepole pine, if you know this area, they're will grow into very dense stands sometimes. More and more as the years or decades go by, more and more dead material accumulating, falling. The forest can be difficult to walk through, not always very pretty compared to other forests. That's just my judgment. But when fire comes, it does the same thing. It's a stand replacement kind of event. So if you've got, there we go. So if you've got a community that's surrounded by lodgepole pines, there's another challenge there to think about. Or if you've got a house that's built next to or within a whole lot of them, because the time will come. And but lodgepoles will do the same kind of thing. They can produce some seed every year, but they also have this response from the small, tight cones that they have to release seeds because of the heat of the fire. And then there's those alpine zones or subalpine zones that I showed you in the earlier map, or near the Sierra crest. Up at a certain point, you reach tree line, you reach an area where there's still trees, but they're sparsely spread out, and fires may happen, may be ignited like this lightning ignited juniper, but they're not going to spread, not readily anyway. It depends, of course, on the wind conditions and a lot of things. But so there's a whole different kind of thing going on there, where most of those trees are not adapted. They're sensitive to fire because they don't have an evolutionary pressure that put together all these various other traits that help protect some of the other trees where fire is more common. Which takes us out into the almost the rest of the Great Basin area where the Eastern Sierra is. We have the sagebrush scrub, sagebrush, rabbitbrush, greasewood, a lot of different species, desert peach. And then where there's enough moisture, all of a sudden it seems like there's a line, just enough change in the amount of water that's available on a hillside. You get the pine forest of the Great Basin, which is pinyon pine and junipers, pinyon juniper woodlands. And fire, again, in this area, because of elevation and snow and the climate, even though it's dry, we don't get as many fires as frequently as the chaparral fires. Sorry, I keep switching my fingers. The chaparral fires of the Coast Range in Southern California. But when they come, they burn like that fire I showed you a few minutes ago that burnt near Mammoth Lake. They burn very hot. And the pinyons and junipers are not well adapted because of the frequency of fire, lower frequency of fire, and pinyons are sensitive to the infrequent fires that come through, and they'll be killed. And I stuck another picture here because part of the story of fire in this particular area and this kind of habitat is what's been happening. Perhaps in a response to years of grazing animals, but we have this invasive cheatgrass that comes in. And the problem with cheatgrass in terms of fire is that it grows up, it dries out quickly, and then to go to seed. And at that point, it's very flammable. It's a flashy fuel, it'll carry fire rapidly. There's not as much biomass involved, but it will move fire along the ground and then into other areas. And it's a real dilemma for what to do about the cheatgrass problem in the Great Basin. Let's talk a little bit about, we've been talking about vegetation, about animals. Fires that are many animals that live in an area where fire comes have the ability to move or to go underground. So if you're a cottontail, or if you're a ground squirrel or chipmunk, going underground into a burrow where the fire, as we talked about, doesn't penetrate as it passes over above you is a viable way to go. Other animals will just run, and some get caught. It just depends on what the particular conditions are, especially things like wind and the whole scale of a fire. This is a fascinating story in fire ecology. There's a beetle that are called fire beetles. I've got the joke is here that they're red hot lovers, because what they do, they have an incredible ability to sense the heat of fire from miles and miles away, and they go towards it. And they're going towards it because they're going to meet up with their mate. They're going to, the females then are going to lay eggs in sometimes trees that are still burning. But these trees, because of what they've just gone through, don't have the ability to fight back against beetles at this point very effectively. The technique to fight off bark beetles is to flood them out with sap, but that's where a tree is alive. So these beetles have been studied by the Department of Defense, trying to understand this in super ability they have for sensing from a great distance the infrared, the heat of a fire. And then there's birds like the black-backed woodpeckers that are fire focused on burned areas, and they're coming because beetles come. They're coming to look for larvae that are in the bark. And also then they'll drill holes and make their nests in cavities in these standing burned trees. This is a LA Times photo that I wanted to put here because these deer made it through the campfire. This is up in Paradise. And they survived. They moved probably away from what was a really fast moving fire and got out of it. But now they're struggling post-fire. And I wouldn't be surprised if the thing that brought them into this burnt town area is a search for water, probably not so much food. But that's when we have these mega fires that we've been having in recent years, the ability to move around and get out of a fire zone and find vegetation and food again is one of the challenges for wildlife. What about the mega fires? This wheel, the size of the pies here is a reflection of the size in acreage, not in terms of impacts on houses or people exactly, but of the 20 largest California wildfires in history since we started recording it. Goes back here to 1932, some relatively small wedges, which were the biggest ones compared to a whole lot of many thousands of other fires. And then something's happened. Something's happened in the last few years, 2019, 2020, 2021. And we'll see how 2022 goes. Some extremely large fires. This is maybe one reason why this whole class, this academy is being put together, is because something's changed, and the something is we'll talk about some of the history that explains some of this and some of the current problem of a climate crisis that's affecting the whole globe. But altogether, it has translated into these extremely large fires with extreme fire behavior associated with them. And that last slide basically talked about how in 2020 we had 4.2 million acres burn, and that made a lot of that is daunting and scary. But the best estimates from scientists studying all of the records that are there in the tree cores and in the looking back through the charcoal layers, is that back before the Spanish arrived in California, probably over 5 million acres experienced some fire every year. 4.2 million acres of disaster in recent years for us. The difference is that these fires had been going on very frequently. They were more moderate. You might call them good fire behavior versus what we were facing recently. And the big difference is that there's almost 40 million, 39 plus million people in California today. And more of us are living in the edges or in the wildland areas, or what were wildland areas. And all of that matters and helps explain what's going on now. Another example of the fire behavior change and some recent history. This is the Creek Fire. It blew up over west of the Sierra, put this giant amount of smoke seen from space up in September of 2020. The index over here to the right is for Levining, where I live, and it's the air quality index where the gauge has moved completely over to as far as it'll go and pegged out. Incredible air quality problems happened for the Eastern Sierra because of this fire on the west side of the Sierra. This is part of why this happened. The west side in the Ponderosa Pine Belt has, after many years of drought and dry and hot, the pine beetles have been winning the battle, and we have this incredible mortality in that pine forest belt. So a lot of standing dead trees. Forest Service put together this map where the bright red is where the most dead trees per acre are. Here's Yosemite. back to that event in September with the Creek Fire. A woman named Thalia provided this picture to me. She was flying in a commercial air flight from Las Vegas to San Francisco. And out her window, just with a regular camera, she took this incredible photo. The smoke column from the Creek Fire was not just massive, but it pumped up through atmospheric layer and penetrated the lowest layer of the stratosphere, 8 miles high. An incredible thing. And that all helps explain some of what this is. This is a view out my window at home in September from the smoke that was coming over the hill, from a fire that wasn't in our particular neighborhood, except we were downwind, and incredible smoke to deal with. And people who are in this part of the world, as Mammoth especially, really know what I'm talking about. But I want to even think about the natural role of smoke because of fire. And that's another example of how, because it helps to illustrate how powerful the evolutionary influence of fire has been on vegetation. We have a species in the chaparral belt in the shrub land that germinates and produces flowers in response to smoke. Not just, like the seeds of a pine tree where it's the heat that's opening up a cone. It's smoke that's doing that here. There's enough of that as part of the evolutionary effect on this whispering bells and beautiful little yellow flowers. So a little more of the history that got us to where we are. A century ago, there was a big debate going on. The Forest Service, the U.S. Forest Service had been just created around early in the 20th century. And out in California, there was a big debate about how to manage fire on rangelands and in ranch lands and in the forests. And there was some kind of ugly things written and said at the time about not following the Indian approach, the savages approach, as it says here, because that's not what they considered forestry, and that the goal was to grow young trees, and so we must keep fire out absolutely. I said it was a debate. It was actually carried on for months, back and forth in some of the journals of the time. This one's the Timberman. This is March of 1920. And the head of the Forest Service, W. Greeley, wrote this article and had these two intriguing photos to illustrate it. And the one on the left, he said, this is what's preferred by the light burners. And the one on the right is what the foresters wanted to see. Today, from our context of looking at this is kind of amazing. And yet there's a lot of thinking that we can grow more trees and we can deal with the fire problem. One of the most eloquent in the debate on the side for the ranchers wanting to continue these burning practices was Stuart White. And he basically summarized his points by saying at that point, 1920, they'd already in just a few decades caught a bear by the tail, and we don't know if we're going to be able to let it go, because it'll turn around and bite us. So lots of that was going on, but a decision was made for a number of reasons. There's history about big fires in the Rockies, especially, to fight all fires and put them out as quickly as possible. And then after World War II, Smokey the Bear campaign got going, and a whole generation here. Come on up. There we go. A whole generation. There it is. Trying to show you something from my childhood. There it is. Generations, not just a whole, but generations since the 1950s have had this, very friendly looking bear telling them, sometimes gruffly, sometimes more, in a very nice way, that they need to help, make sure that there's no wildfires. It was forest fires was the first message, and then now it's become wildfires. Smokey's message has become a little more nuanced. Here's some of the other history for the Forest Service. Back in the 1970s, a change was starting to happen. And it was in those years that some academic people from the forestry departments at Berkeley and others had been advocating for a solution to that bear that we got caught by that we have by the tail, and basically a solution that would try to bring fire back into this, what was at this point fire-starved habitat. And in 1978, the national policy on federal lands became that they wouldn't suppress all wildfires. And it started to be used, but the acreage was not effective. And then there were setbacks in terms of liability and some escapes. A lot of things that kept this from being, and we're talking about what, 75, 70s. That's almost 50 years ago, a half century ago, when this policy was, an attempt was being made. In the state park system, this is in giant sequoias in the Calaveras Big Trees State Park. Dr. Harold Biswell, a professor at UC Berkeley, was showing that right here, this is how deep the duff was, where they had just conducted a burn to get some fire back into that sequoia forest. It was beginning then, and then we just jump forward to today and think about how 50 years have gone by and how much there is really to be done. Giant sequoias are a special case and a very good example of a fire-adapted species. They have a very thick, almost asbestos-like bark. They have serotomous cones. This cross section of a sequoia shows that there's a big fire scar here. Didn't kill the tree, and then each one of these lines you can count the years between with the most significant fires that occurred in this particular tree's life. Frequent fire. That for there to be reproduction in giant sequoia, really you need to open up these serotomous cones. This is a very small cone, very tiny seeds, and then you need to have sunlight and of course the ash of a fire does some fertilizing. And then these big trees can grow baby trees. Giant sequoias are amazing. But take a look. This is the next three pictures. This one and the next two are one of the best examples of kind of maybe how we got into some of the problems that we have today with fire. You see these people, they're not little people, they're just normal people standing next to incredible trees. Take a look at this fire scar right here in this particular one. And follow that. There it is again in 1970. And what you don't see are the rest of the giant sequoias that are out there behind this tangle of fir trees. Fir trees do very well coming in as young trees into shaded areas. And but at this point, if a fire got started on the ground, it would be carried up high into the giant sequoias and was an incredible threat to these trees. Plus, there was just no reproduction going on of giant sequoia in the park. This is the Mariposa Grove in Yosemite National Park. And Yosemite got going in the 70s. They really started, they had to begin with some the kind of thing we're seeing a lot of now, a lot of piling and burning, and then broadcast burning, letting fire move through the groves again. Here's that tree with the fire scar. There's my wife standing next to these giant sequoias. And this particular area got good attention and is a real success story. And of course, we know that there's many hundreds of thousands of acres out here in the West that where the challenge is at having the money and equipment and time and ability to do something like what the Park Service did here in the Mariposa Grove. Yosemite's also burning in the meadows in Yosemite Valley. They're following a kind of fire regime that keeps the trees from moving in and taking over the meadows, but they're following a pattern that the indigenous people they utilized fire in Yosemite, but also across much or most of California to accomplish ends that they had, like the recovery after a fire will produce straight-stemmed willows, which were what they needed for basketry. The fires would benefit species that had bulbs like little potatoes underground that were food. And promote their ability to have more of those. So lots of different benefits, and some having to do with hunting too, with wildlife. So some pictures of some more recent things that are happening. This is pile burning near Mono City, near Mill Creek, out of below Lundy Canyon. This is something that's underway right now. This week, it was in the news that the piles of cut and piled stacks waiting to burn up in the lake basin of Mammoth Lakes are being burned because there's snow on the ground. This is actually not that area. This is an older picture off of Eldorado, in the Eldorado National Forest, but taking advantage, as the Indians did, of the ability to burn some areas that were defined and bounded by snow at the right time. Down in certain of the drier hillsides and desert environments to our south, there's use of prescribed fire. So that's a thing we're hearing a lot about, and there's a lot of money coming that direction to try to work with fuel treatments that will reduce the fuels and kind of reset these landscapes back to a more a condition where people can basically, and the landscape and the natural values can all be able to live through the challenges of fire. Talk about challenges of fire. This was a picture that was out in the media. I got permission to use in my book of flying sparks in the wind. And one of the stories that really needs to get out about, and when you get into listen to the folks talking about what we need to do to structures, is to think about not just flames coming, but especially really the insidious entry of sparks coming and finding something to ignite. I took this picture in the Eastern Sierra. I'm not going to embarrass anybody by telling you where it is, but my gosh, what a roof. And look at the needles. And I don't know why there's an extension cord running across that, it looks like. But what you don't ever want is to have a roof fire. If you've got the right kind of roof, you can avoid that. And here's a great example. It's also in the Eastern Sierra. Good friends of mine built a house in the pine forest. They knew where they were. They took a look at what the conditions were, and there's almost every recommendation you're going to hear is inherent in this home. A metal roof, eaves that are enclosed, decks that don't have any way for embers to get under them, built with material, stucco that's not so flammable, lots of things and going into this kind of thinking. You're going to hear about defensible space. We all do. It's a requirement. There's legal requirements to take care of our own areas around our own land. One thing I think it's important to keep in mind is that the first 30 feet around structures, if you have control over that, that's where you want to go lean, green, clean. Beyond that, sometimes there's confusion about whether you should just bulldoze everything. And of course, a lot depends on topography and stuff, but there's really the recommendations are what you see here. You can leave some of the native brush retained, and more the farther out you go. Whether you, again, can control that distance from your own house is the question. And also, like, I live right next to a cliff right here, and that has effects on how fire is going to behave coming uphill. There's another one that people need to keep in mind. The firewood stacked against houses. In the winter, it's so really nice to be able to just step out onto the porch and grab the wood and go back in. And when there's a whole lot of snow around and there's very little low fire risk, maybe that makes sense. But the rest of the year, these firewood stacks, because they have an incredible amount of energy stored in them, a cord 4 by 4 by 8 feet has 106 is the equivalent of 160 gallons of gasoline. You don't want to stack them against your house. And just a couple more final things that are part of the latest things that have been happening. We've got a lot of Southern California Edison action in this region in this year. They're using helicopters, they're using drones to inspect and then to come in and repair where need be, because more and more fires have been laid down to wind events that cause sparking in these power lines. And PG&E is basically facing bankruptcy. They've now vowed to do something that's incredibly expensive, but to start burying their power lines. I asked this question just because I often have trouble remembering. What's a PSPS? You got it? Power safety, no, power shut off. Yeah, and anyway, they're difficult to deal with, and they cause them, having the power shut off during an event is in itself a problem. So what's going on? This has been in the news this year, that if you look back 22 years now, we have been in a pattern that is dominated by drought. It's the longest stretch of such dry years in 1,200 years. And that affects fire, that affects water and our water supply and the landscape's water. It affects everything that lives in California. Why is that happening? Well, it's a human answer. This is a quote from Scientific American 2 years ago, or a year and a half ago. The number of dry, warm, and windy autumn days, the wildfire weather in California has more than doubled since the 1980s. This is the climate crisis we're talking about. It's not the whole story. They say more than half of the acres burned in the western U.S. could be attributed now to climate change. It's not the whole story. We've got other things going on, like policy in relation to fire and firefighting and thinning and all of those things. But we have to address it. It's the crisis of our generation. So here's my question to you, and that's a question that I hope you'll keep in mind as you take part in this academy for the next few weeks. Can we join what is a very long list of fire-adapted species in California? Can we become comfortable with living in this fire environment? And I'll finish with Dr. Harold Biswell's quote that we should keep in mind that all the things we value, I'm paraphrasing here, all the things that are out there in the natural environment, everything good, as he put it, evolved with fire. And that's what I brought to you today. There's my book cover. It's available basically wherever books are sold, or it can be requested if the bookstore doesn't have it. This is the second edition, and it's if you like some of these pictures, realize this book has 111 of them. So it's loaded with that. So it's a fun book in that sense. So I'm going to stop sharing, and I guess we'll get out into questions and the chat and that kind of thing.
Great. Thank you, Dave. Great job. Lots of good information. Before we get into questions, I would just tell everyone a lot of the things Dave talked about, we're going to cover in these additional sessions. He's sort of teased a lot of these issues. We'll talk about fire ecology next month, home hardening, fuel treatments, smoke, even insurance and some other activities of our fire safe councils and our fire departments. A lot of things we'll have an opportunity to talk about. The list of topics was in some of the stories that have been in the media, and we'll continue to put out information each month about the particular topic that comes up. I may juggle some of the topics compared to what schedule's already out there so that they flow a little better. But I just want to tell everybody a lot of the things Dave talked about, we just, he gave you a little bit of a teaser to get into them, and we'll get into a lot more detail with some panels of speakers. So let's take questions. We have the ability to, if you want to put your hand up, we have the ability to make you a panelist or whatever it takes from our magic Zoom session to get your question asked. So go ahead.
And some of you have also noticed that the chat function still works as well. If you are too shy to want to be a panelist, you can always type your question.
Yeah, Dave, if you can see them in the chat, you want to just go ahead and read them and answer them?
Let's see. Let me open that up. Oh, I like that. Brilliant work. Well done. Thank you. Here's one that's going to be more challenging. Thanks for all the good information. Glad to hear Lakes Basin fire teepees are going to be burned soon. We have a cabin in very many, very close to us. Yeah, it's been a long time, and with them still there, they're still a fuel threat. Up above that, there's Jeffrey pines have a high content of heptane, a flammable substance. Are Jeffreys more problematic than other trees? And they're characterized as no. The answer being no, because of the bark protection that goes on with those trees, because of the dropping of the branches that allows them to not have have a ground fire, not be a real threat. And so I think once you get them down, and once you get them penetrated, maybe that is where they become very flammable. I know I burn a lot of Jeffrey in my wood stove, and it's not the ideal wood because it burns too fast and hot, but it's what's very available in our part of the world. So I don't know if that answers that, but generally they're considered to be one of the species of trees that in the forest, in the Jeffrey and the ponderosa forest, fire, they have adapted to these regimes of mostly low intensity ground fire.
Great. Carrie, why don't you go ahead with your question?
Hi, David. Thank you for that awesome presentation. You're just as wonderful as Scott Stevens, who I study and work with at UC Berkeley. But anyway, I have a major concern about fire and wonder if anyone on the panel can answer that. I know that there's been a lot of funding for fire in Mono County, a tremendous amount of money funded, but you have the precarious problem of working with federal land, which not everybody, you can't fight fire on that land. And I'm wondering if you know what is being done to get that past that, like right away.
That sounds like a county supervisor question. I mean, I will just say that what I know is that there is a big federal and state response to this crisis, this situation we've seen in the last few years, and money's coming from both directions. And some of the response is to hire more people who are in the, I like to call it the peacemaking business versus the firefighting business, the warriors, and also to try to apply fire. And there's going to be plenty of debates through all of this, because there's still plenty of debates about logging versus thinning versus how much fire spread there can be, all of those things. But in terms of a relationship between the county, Bob, you have any knowledge that you want to share?
I would just mention a couple of things, Carrie, in response to your question, and I'd also defer to my colleague, Stacy Corliss, who has been involved at the state level with a lot of the wildfire management programs. I think it's true, there's a lot of money available. The issue is getting the money here and then applying it. We do have a great project in the Mammoth area. They're calling it the Donut Project because it's around the town, and we'll be hearing a lot more about that project. That project is moving ahead, is a major project. There will be a session on fuels treatment and thinning, and we'll have Janet Hatfield and some others that are heavily involved with that project at the Zoom session. I don't know whether that one is July or August. I'm not sure, but we'll have some time on that. And of course, the Forest Service is involved in treatment and thinning, and we'll have an opportunity to have them come on and talk about the projects they're doing, the number of acres and that sort of thing. So there is, you're right, resources available to do it. It's also a matter of how much can they do, even if they have resources, and how much progress can we make against what we really should be doing or would like to do. And so we'll have a session on that this summer that gets into much more detail about that. Stacy, I don't know whether you'd want to add anything on that.
I was going to promote her, but I wasn't sure.
Okay.
I don't see her hand up, so. Oh, there she goes. Okay, I didn't want to put her on the spot. She'll be in soon. And Carrie, I'm going to put you back to attendee, okay?
Do you want me to answer some of these? Oh, Stacy coming there. Hi, Stacy.
Hi, am I on? Sorry, I don't have my video on because I'm actually in my car driving to Sacramento
Sorry to
talk
put you on
about
the
this
spot,
stuff.
Stacy. Go ahead.
No, that's okay. Carrie, we've corresponded about this. I just like to add a real message of hope around this issue, that I think the ability now to plan, fund, and implement wildfire prevention projects on public lands in collab with local government, federal agencies, and state government working, and I hope tribal governments too, working together hand in hand to address this problem has, I guess what I'm trying to say, the effort has never been greater. And as already mentioned, there's a tremendous amount of funding. We have a great project planned in Mono County, and talks of planning even more. And so I think, yeah, look forward to this summer when we hear from our Inyo and Humboldt-Toyabe National Forest representatives to hear what they have planned. The Forest Service has just issued a 10-year wildfire strategy to address wildfires, and there's funding behind it. Just to the west of us on the Stanislaus National Forest, there's a project that just received, I think, $80 million to implement a landscape level, I think much bigger than ours, maybe over 100,000 acres of land will be treated. So there are big things happening. So I think there's a lot of reason to feel optimistic about our ability to partner together and address this issue, even though it is still scary, I know.
And we could say, having studied a lot of this history, finally. I hope so. There's some more chats. Do I want to go back to that, or Stacey?
I'll go ahead and read them out loud for you.
Okay.
So the next one is from Mark, and it's: how important is the undergrounding of power lines in protecting our communities from wildfire?
Well, yes, maybe the word that's I'm stumbling over here is important versus essential. If it was all done, how important would that be? It would be much more, everybody could feel much more secure about the problems of sparking overhead lines. Is it essential? Edison seems to think not. They have thrown a lot of work, a lot of money into improving and replacing and monitoring above ground infrastructure around here. But PG&E, faced with being convicted of starting a number of some of the worst big and deadly fires, has decided to make this, whether they'll follow through, we'll see, but to make this move, they feel that that's maybe their only way to demonstrate that they will address the problem. So I don't have a real black and white answer for it, though. I certainly don't want anything sparking in my neighborhood.
Okay. So the next one are from Crystal. What are the most flammable, dangerous plants that should be removed for defensible space around your home?
Again, I want to characterize it a little differently than just a plant being flammable and dangerous. The zone closest, we talked about 30 feet to a structure, basically needs to not be flammable. They're talking about green. We're talking about low, and maybe just certainly nothing right up against a building. When I moved into a home I'm in now, there were ornamental juniper shrubs right up against the house, and they're very, very flammable species. They're not there now. So that's the first step. So beyond that, if you're working with the native vegetation, basically everything out there is pretty flammable, and it's a matter of thinning and reducing height, and basically so that a fire coming in. I think I mentioned at some point tonight about one of the fires where the shrubs themselves were 6 feet taller, above my head. and the flame length off of those is going to be 4 times that, so you just pick. I think it's good when you're working around your community, around your house, to have a visual of, okay, those shrubs, what will be the flames I'm going to see when it's on fire. And then don't forget that back to the house itself, when you're just not talking about vegetation, this whole thing about how a house is designed and hardened to avoid the embers that will come flying in a wind-driven fire. So and I hope that helps. Yeah.
And this last question from Mary might be better to wait until the Forest Service does join us, but it says, is there any way the Forest Service will revisit their opposition to metal roofs on cabins?
I think you should ask the Forest Service.
And I don't see any other questions, and I don't see any other hands up.
I would just say good luck with this, wonderful idea. If I had any druthers, I would say Bob ought to accelerate it so instead of taking 7 months to complete, it should take a lot less time and try to get it done. But fire season's coming. And fire season's here year round almost now, but you know what I'm saying. Yeah, August is coming.
Well, think about that, Dave. I've had some others mention that. I was trying to spread it out so that everybody could kind of get in their mind the third Monday of every month, but your point is well made. And so we're still, a little bit of working this as we're moving along. But I appreciate that suggestion and any other suggestions. And Dave, if you'd put your email in the chat, and I'll do the same thing. Any feedback on suggestions for this, or any questions for either of us as we move forward, I'd appreciate that. And I think that's it. If we don't have any other questions, our next session will be May 16th at 6 p.m. And that will feature a panel of experts speaking about fire ecology. Dave touched on that a bit tonight, but we'll get into much more detail, and I think it'll be very interesting and informative. So put May 16th at 6 p.m. on your calendar, and I look forward to seeing you and others on that evening. So thank you. I'll go ahead and put my information in there right now as well.
I already beat you to the punch, Bob.
Okay.
And again, if you want to recommend someone watch this, the link to Mono County's YouTube channel is at the beginning of the chat.
Okay, if that's it. Thank you all for attending. And again, we will see you all Monday night, May 16th at 6 p.m. Thank you.